I'm sorry, but you must be lost, child. The cleaning department is in the basement. The receptionist didn't even bother to look up from her glowing computer screen when she saw the 8-year-old girl standing at the polished marble counter of Blackstone Corporation. Lee Santos, a small figure in the vast, imposing lobby, adjusted the strap of her school backpack, its weight a familiar burden on her small shoulders. She lifted her chin with a quiet determination that finally made the woman behind the desk glance up, her eyes narrowing in surprise. I have a 9 o'clock interview with Mr. Richard Thornfield for the position of project manager. The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to absorb the ambient hum of the corporate giant. Even the executives in their impeccably tailored suits, usually gliding through the lobby with single-minded purpose, slowed their pace, their hushed conversations faltering. The receptionist blinked several times, her expression a mix of disbelief and annoyance, as if trying to process an impossible mathematical equation. Very funny, dear. Where are your parents? My mother, Claudia Santos, has been in the municipal hospital with pneumonia since last night, Lee replied, her voice steady, remarkably calm, as if she were merely reciting her multiplication tables. There was no tremor of fear, no hint of childish exaggeration. She spent the last 3 months preparing for this interview and asked me to come in her place to deliver her portfolio. At 8 years old, Lee already carried responsibilities on her shoulders that most children would never know. The daughter of a brilliant engineer who had been systematically rejected in dozens of interviews, always with polite excuses that masked obvious prejudice, Lee had learned early on that the world would not be fair to people like them. The night before, as her mother coughed violently in her hospital bed, Claudia had held her daughter's small hand with desperate strength. Promise me, Lee. Promise me you'll deliver that briefcase. They need to see that we're more than they think we are. An imposing figure emerged from the executive elevator, cutting a sharp silhouette against the polished chrome. Richard Thornfield, CEO of Blackstone, was known throughout the business district as much for his ruthless arrogance as for his selective hiring policies. At 45, he had built an empire by systematically eliminating any employee who did not fit his ideal mold of corporate excellence. His icy blue eyes scanned the lobby until they landed on the unusual scene, a small black child standing defiantly at the reception desk. The sight immediately bothered him, not out of compassion, but because he considered it an inappropriate intrusion, a breach of the immaculate, controlled environment of his space of power. What's the problem here, Jennifer? He asked the receptionist, his voice carrying the clipped, impatient tone of someone who had no time for humanitarian nonsense. Mr. Thornfield, this girl says she has an interview with you. Thornfield approached, his gaze sharp, studying Lee as a scientist might observe an interesting specimen. There was something disturbing about the way the child looked back at him, not with fear or admiration, but with a cold, unsettling assessment that made him feel a flicker of discomfort, a sensation he rarely experienced. Really? And what would your name be, little one? Lee Santos. My mother is Claudia Santos, a project engineer specializing in strategic management and corporate sustainability. Lee unzipped her backpack and, with surprising dexterity, removed a thick folder, organized with military precision. She has prepared a complete presentation on how to reduce Blackstone's operating costs by 30% while maintaining the same quality standards. Thornfield raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement playing on his lips. The idea of a black child thinking she could impress him was almost comical. For years, he had perfected the art of rejecting unsuitable candidates with polite smiles and technically sound excuses that could never be legally challenged. How lovely, he muttered, more to himself than to her. And tell me, Lee, does your mother really believe that sending a child in her place demonstrates professionalism? She believes that competence speaks louder than prejudice, Lee replied, her small hand extending the folder to him, her gaze unwavering. And that intelligent people recognize good ideas, regardless of who presents them. For a moment, something flashed in Thornfield's eyes, a mixture of surprise and irritation. He took the folder and glanced through the first few pages. The numbers were impossible to ignore. More than that, they were revolutionary and could save the company millions. But Richard Thornfield hadn't risen to the top by being impressed by emotional tricks from people he considered fundamentally unsuitable for his corporate environment. He closed the folder with a sharp snap, a dismissive sound, as if discarding something worthless. Interesting, he admitted coldly. But tell me something, Lee, did your mother really think an emotional trick like this would work on me? That I would let myself be swayed by a touching situation? The question hung in the air like a sharp blade. Lee kept her gaze steady, but for a microscopic moment, something flashed across her eyes. Not fear, but a kind of silent recognition, as if this reaction was exactly what she had expected, what her mother had predicted. She said you'd reveal who you really are within the first 5 minutes, Lee replied calmly, her voice carrying a disturbing, almost adult maturity. It seems she was right. Thornfield's patronizing smile faltered for a split second. There was something about this child, the way she looked at him, that bothered him in a way he couldn't explain, as if she knew something he didn't, as if he was being evaluated and found wanting by an 8-year-old girl. How presumptuous, he said, trying to regain control of the situation, the authority in his voice wavering slightly. Perhaps your mother should teach her some manners before sending her out to play grown-up. But as he spoke, Thornfield didn't notice that Jennifer, the receptionist, had discreetly activated the security recording system that captured audio. Nor did he notice that 2 black employees of the company passing through the lobby had stopped to watch the scene with increasingly grim expressions. What Richard Thornfield definitely didn't know was that that briefcase contained much more than just proposals for operational improvements, and that underestimating a desperate mother and her extraordinarily courageous daughter would be the first step toward the biggest mistake of his career. What standards? Lee asked, tilting her head slightly, her gaze unwavering, carrying what seemed like genuine, innocent curiosity. The question caught Thornfield completely off guard. For a moment, he found himself struggling, internally fumbling for a response that didn't sound exactly like what it was. Pure, unadulterated prejudice. Standards of excellence, professionalism. People who understand how things work in the real world. His voice, though he tried to keep it steady, betrayed a subtle tremor. My mother has 2 master's degrees, 15 years of experience, and proposals that could save your company millions. Lee replied calmly, her voice a precise, surgical instrument. What standards is she not meeting, exactly? Jennifer, the receptionist, coughed uncomfortably, a small, nervous sound. A few employees passing through the lobby began to slow their pace, their hushed conversations dying out as they realized something far more serious than a lost child was unfolding. Among them, Patricia Williams, one of the few black women in leadership positions at the company, stopped completely, her eyes fixed on the scene. Thornfield felt a growing irritation, a prickling sensation of being cornered. This child was asking questions he would rather not answer publicly, especially not here, in his pristine, controlled environment. Listen, little girl, this is no place for games. Maybe when you grow up, you'll understand how serious business works. He attempted a dismissive wave of his hand, a gesture of finality. I understand perfectly how it works, Lee replied, her voice remaining disturbingly calm, cutting through his pretense. You reject qualified people for reasons you can't say out loud, then make up technical excuses to justify decisions you've already made before you even look at their resume. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with unspoken accusations. Thornfield looked around, his gaze darting nervously, realizing he now had a sizable audience. Black employees watched the scene with increasingly tense expressions, and he could feel the palpable weight of every gaze, a silent judgment that unsettled him. Her mother must be very proud to have raised such an audacious child, he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a transparent attempt to regain control of the crumbling situation. She is, Lee confirmed simply, her eyes locking onto his, especially after she found out about Blackstone's hiring pattern over the last 5 years. A sudden chill ran down Thornfield's spine. Hiring pattern. There were internal protocols, confidential memos, hiring strategies, information that should never have been leaked. What pattern? He managed to ask, his voice tight. Lee opened her backpack again and took out a second folder, smaller than the first, but clearly packed. Mom spent a lot of time researching before she applied. She found some interesting things about corporate diversity, or rather, the lack of it. Thornfield's confidence began to waver, a cold dread seeping into him. There was something about the way this child spoke, the way each word seemed carefully chosen, that made him deeply uneasy. It was as if she were following a specific, damning script. "Statistics can be manipulated," he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed his growing nervousness. "They can," Lee agreed, opening the folder slightly to reveal photocopies of documents that made Thornfield's face pale, his composure cracking further. "But it's hard to manipulate internal emails, memos, and meeting recordings, especially when people think they're just talking among like-minded people." Thornfield's blood ran cold. Those documents. How did an 8-year-old have access to internal company communications? "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, though his eyes betrayed his fear. "Of course you do," Lee replied, closing the folder with a movement that chillingly mirrored the dismissive gesture he had made moments earlier. The quiet click of the folder resonated in the tense air. "The question is, do you want to find out how much Mom knows here, in front of everyone, or would you prefer a private conversation?" Patricia Williams approached discreetly, pretending to check something on her tablet, but clearly her full attention was on how the situation would unfold. Other employees made similar subtle moves, forming an ever-growing audience for their CEO's public embarrassment. Thornfield realized he was being masterfully manipulated, led by an 8-year-old into a trap he couldn't quite identify, yet knew was closing around him. "My office. Now," he said through clenched teeth, his voice a low growl. "Great choice," Lee replied with a smile that seemed strangely adult, almost knowing. "Mom always says important conversations deserve privacy." As they walked toward the executive elevator, Thornfield's mind raced, desperate to process what had just happened. How had an unemployed engineer and her young daughter obtained such damning, inside information about his company? More importantly, what exactly did they know about his hiring practices? In the elevator, Lee watched the numbers rise with her usual calm, as if she was strolling through a park instead of confronting one of the most powerful men in the city. "Mr. Thornfield," she asked, her voice quiet but piercing, "Mom always says that the most dangerous people are those who have nothing to lose." She looked directly at him, her eyes carrying a maturity impossible for her age. "We both fit that category now." "You're just a child," Thornfield replied, but his voice sounded less convincing than he had hoped, the authority draining from it. "I am," Lee agreed quietly, "but children ask questions that adults are afraid to ask. And sometimes, those questions are exactly what the world needs to hear." The elevator stopped on the 40th floor, and the doors opened to reveal the immaculate, hushed surroundings of the executive office. But as Thornfield led Lee down the hallway, past the gleaming surfaces and hushed whispers, he couldn't shake the chilling feeling that he wasn't leading the situation. He was being led by her. Thornfield's secretary, Mrs. Davidson, a woman whose calm demeanor usually mirrored his own, looked genuinely surprised to see the CEO accompanied by an 8-year-old child. "Mr. Thornfield, your 10 o'clock meeting. Cancel everything until further notice," he cut her off abruptly, his voice sharper than intended, the frustration barely contained. He pushed open the door to his immaculate office with more force than necessary. As Lee calmly entered his corporate sanctuary, her eyes curiously surveying the awards, certificates, and photographs that adorned the walls, Thornfield closed the door and turned to face her, his posture rigid. "Now, let's settle this once and for all," he said, attempting to regain his lost authority, his voice strained. "What exactly do you and your mother want?" Lee sat down in the plush leather chair across from his imposing desk, her feet dangling slightly above the rich carpet. Yet, her gaze remained steady and determined, a stark contrast to her diminutive size. "We want exactly what we've asked for from the beginning, a fair chance." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "But it seems you'd rather do this the hard way." Each new revelation from this impossible child was meticulously writing his own sentence of defeat, and the scariest part was that Richard Thornfield was beginning to realize that it might already be too late to stop what was coming. For a moment, as she smiled politely and organized the folders on her lap, any casual observer would think they were seeing just a child visiting the office. But those who truly understood power knew that it sometimes came in the most unexpected and devastating packages. Thornfield walked behind his imposing mahogany desk, trying to re-establish his position of power, to physically dominate the space. "All right, little girl, now that we're alone, how about we stop this charade and you tell me what you really want?" Lee settled deeper into the chair as if she were at home, swinging her legs gently as she organized the folders on her lap. Acting. Mr. Thornfield, I don't know what you're talking about. I just came to deliver my mother's portfolio and discuss her qualifications. Cut that. Thornfield growled, losing the last vestiges of the composure he had worked so hard to cultivate. You mentioned internal documents, emails, recordings. An 8-year-old doesn't have access to that kind of information. Who's behind this? Mom always says that smart people ask the right questions of the right people, Lee replied, opening the second folder, its contents now visible. And that disgruntled employees are great sources of information, especially when they feel protected by anonymity. Thornfield's blood ran cold. Disgruntled employees. Patricia Williams from Human Resources, Lee said casually, as if commenting on the weather, her voice calm. She was very upset when she found out that qualified black candidates were systematically rejected with fabricated excuses. James Morrison from the finance department was not happy when he learned that the company paid extra bonuses to managers who maintained cultural uniformity in their teams. Thornfield leaned heavily on the desk, feeling the world spin beneath him. These were trusted employees, people he would never have suspected of treason. That's impossible. They signed confidentiality agreements. They did, Lee agreed cheerfully, her innocence a stark contrast to the gravity of her words. But Mom found out that confidentiality agreements don't apply when it comes to illegal practices. And racial discrimination is a federal crime, isn't it? At that precise moment, Thornfield's phone rang. Mrs. Davidson's voice, now tense and hurried, came through the speaker. Mr. Thornfield, there's a lawyer here who wants to talk to you. He says it's urgent, and that it's about the girl in your office. Lee smiled, a small, knowing smile. Oh, it must be Dr. Martinez. Mom asked him to come pick up the documents after I finished the presentation. What documents? Thornfield asked, though he already knew the answer, a sickening dread filling him. The copies of the emails, memos, and recordings I mentioned, Lee explained patiently, her tone almost pedagogical. Mom always makes backup copies. Dr. Martinez specializes in workplace discrimination cases. He said his rarely seen evidence so, what he called incriminating. Thornfield clenched his fist, his knuckles white. That's blackmail. No, Lee corrected him, her voice maintaining that hauntingly adult calm. Blackmail would be if we were asking for money or special privileges. We just want what Mom deserves, a fair chance, based on her qualifications. The CEO tried to regain control, desperate to find a loophole. Even if those allegations were true, a company the size of Blackstone has the resources to fight any lawsuit. Your lawyers wouldn't stand a chance. You're right, Lee admitted, her gaze unwavering. If it were just Mom against Blackstone, it would be an unfair fight. She opened the larger folder and pulled out a printed list. But what if there were 57 of us? Thornfield took the list with trembling hands. Names, dates, positions they had applied for, qualifications, official reasons for rejection. A pattern so clear, so undeniable, that even a first-year law student could prove systematic discrimination. Mom spent the last 3 months contacting people who were rejected by Blackstone in the last 5 years, Lee explained, her voice relentless. She found that they all had something in common, exceptional competence and characteristics that didn't fit your ideal pattern. Impossible, Thornfield muttered, but his hands trembled as he leafed through the names. He remembered several of them, candidates who were truly impressive but whom he had rejected for reasons he would never admit publicly. Lee continued, unwavering. Dr. Martinez said that a class action lawsuit like this could result in millions of dollars in damages, not to mention the damage to the company's reputation and possible federal sanctions. The phone rang again, insistently. Mr. Thornfield, Mrs. Davidson's tense voice filled the speaker. There are journalists in the lobby. They say they want to talk about discriminatory practices at the company. Lee glanced at the watch on her wrist, a tiny, almost theatrical gesture. Oh, that must be the Channel 7 news crew. Mom scheduled a press conference for noon. She thought it would be interesting to give the media an opportunity to cover a story about social justice. You can't do that, Thornfield whispered, panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. We already have, Lee replied simply, her composure absolute. The question now is, do you want to be remembered as the CEO who maintained discriminatory practices until he was forced to change them publicly, or as the visionary leader who recognized his mistakes and implemented progressive reforms voluntarily? For the first time in his career, Richard Thornfield found himself completely outmatched by an opponent, and the fact that this opponent was an 8-year-old child only made his defeat more bitter. What exactly do you want? Thornfield asked, his voice defeated, for the first time in decades stripped of its usual arrogance. Lee methodically organized the papers with the precision of an experienced lawyer, her small hands moving with an almost unsettling efficiency. We want you to hire my mother, implement fair hiring policies, and compensate the 57 people who were discriminated against. Or would you rather explain to the media why you rejected more qualified candidates than your current employees? That's absurd. Thornfield tried to regain some semblance of his authority, but his voice came out shaky, a weak tremor betraying his inner turmoil. Even if I agreed to hire your mother, I can't just. Yes, you can, Lee interrupted calmly, her gaze unwavering, a small, knowing glint in her eyes. Especially considering that this conversation has been recorded for the past 20 minutes. Thornfield's blood ran cold. What? Lee discreetly pointed to the small brooch on her blouse, a tiny, almost imperceptible device that had been quietly capturing every word. Mom always says that important people make important confessions when they feel safe. Dr. Martinez will love to hear you admit that you reject people for characteristics that don't fit the ideal pattern. Thornfield stood up abruptly, panic finally shattering his composure. You can't use that. It's illegal to record conversations without consent. Not when it's evidence of federal crimes, a male voice said from the doorway. Dr. Martinez, a tall man of Latin descent, entered the office, carrying a briefcase. Richard Thornfield, I'm Roberto Martinez, a civil rights attorney. I need to inform you that my client has substantial evidence of systematic discrimination. You can't prove anything. Thornfield growled, but the sweat beading on his forehead and his trembling hands betrayed his desperate bluff. Dr. Martinez opened the briefcase and pulled out stacks of neatly organized documents. We have internal emails where you instruct managers to maintain cultural uniformity, recordings of meetings where you discuss filtering out unsuitable elements, financial reports showing bonuses paid specifically for maintaining homogeneous teams. And this, Lee added, handing a tablet to Dr. Martinez, her movements fluid and deliberate, is a recording of our conversation from the last 20 minutes, where he admits to rejecting people for not fitting the ideal standard. Thornfield slumped heavily into his chair, the crushing weight of the situation finally hitting him with full force. His empire of carefully constructed lies was crumbling around him. You planned all of this. We planned justice, Dr. Martinez corrected firmly, his voice resonating with quiet power. And fortunately, we have more than enough evidence. The class action lawsuit we filed this morning includes not only discrimination but also retaliation, creation of a hostile environment, and violation of federal civil rights. The phone rang insistently. Mrs. Davidson spoke into the speakerphone, her voice heavy with urgency. Mr. Thornfield, the board of directors is here. They say it's a legal emergency, and there are a lot of reporters in the lobby right now. Oh, yes, Lee said cheerfully, a chillingly innocent tone in her voice. Mom scheduled the press conference for now. Channel 7, Channel 12, and the Business Tribune. They want to talk about discriminatory practices in large corporations. Thornfield buried his face in his hands, his defeat absolute. You're going to destroy the company. No, Dr. Martinez corrected him firmly, his voice unwavering. You destroyed your own reputation with your actions. We're just making sure there are consequences. The door opened again, and Patricia Williams entered with 3 other black company employees, their faces resolute. Mr. Thornfield, we need to talk. All of us. Patricia, this isn't the time. Thornfield began, his voice hoarse with desperation. This is exactly the time, she interrupted, her voice strong and clear. Because we finally have the courage to speak up. James Morrison is preparing a full financial report on the discriminatory bonuses. Sandra Davis from accounting has copies of all the emails, and Michael Chun from the legal department has already spoken to federal authorities. Thornfield looked around, his eyes wide with horror, realizing he was completely surrounded, betrayed by the very system of control he had meticulously built. "You all betrayed me." "We haven't," Patricia replied with dignity, her gaze steady. "We've stopped being accomplices to your prejudice." Dr. Martinez closed his briefcase with a crisp, satisfying snap. "Mr. Thornfield, you have two options. We can resolve this civilly: immediate hiring of Claudia Santos, implementation of fair policies, compensation for victims of discrimination. Or, we can let the courts, the media, and the board decide your fate." "And if I choose to fight?" Lee replied, her voice maintaining a maturity that was startlingly adult. "Then prepare to explain publicly why a company that makes $300 million a year can't find room for qualified black professionals." At that moment, Mrs. Davidson rushed in. "Mr. Thornfield, your wife is on the line. She says she saw your name in the news online and needs to talk to you urgently." The empire of arrogance and prejudice that Richard Thornfield had built over decades was crumbling in real time, and the catalyst had been an 8-year-old girl who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. As he tried to process the full extent of his defeat, one last surprise awaited him, because outside his office, Claudia Santos had just arrived at the building, recovered and ready to witness firsthand the victory her brave daughter had won on her behalf. "I accept," Thornfield murmured, his voice defeated, echoing through the silent office. "I'll hire her mother, implement the policies, and compensate the victims." Dr. Martinez smiled, pulling a prepared contract from his briefcase. "Excellent decision. The agreement includes the immediate hiring of Claudia Santos as Director of Diversity and Inclusion, with a salary equivalent to that of the other directors, compensation of $200,000 for each of the 57 victims of discrimination, and the implementation of transparent policies overseen by an external audit." "And if I refuse to sign?" Lee looked at him with that hauntingly adult calm, her small face giving away nothing. "Then in 15 minutes, when Mom arrives, she'll hold a press conference explaining how a multimillionaire CEO refuses to hire qualified people because of racial prejudice. I'm sure the board of directors will love to see the company's stock plummet." At that moment, Mrs. Davidson knocked on the door. "Mr. Thornfield, there's a lady here claiming to be Claudia Santos. She says she's here to pick up her daughter." "Send her in," Dr. Martinez instructed before Thornfield could respond. Claudia Santos entered the office with the dignity of a queen, despite her simple clothes and the obvious signs that she had just left the hospital. Her eyes met Lee's first, silently checking that her daughter was okay, a mother's profound relief flickering in their depths, before turning to Thornfield. "Mr. Thornfield," she said calmly, her voice steady and clear. "I've come to pick up my daughter and discuss the terms of my employment." "Her hiring?" Thornfield repeated weakly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Mom always says it's best to negotiate from a position of strength," Lee explained cheerfully, a genuine, childlike smile finally gracing her lips. "And we've discovered we have quite a lot of strength." 3 hours later, the news was spreading across social media like wildfire. Blackstone CEO implements revolutionary diversity program after confrontation with 8-year-old. The video of Lee entering the building and leaving alongside her mother, now officially hired, went viral in minutes. Patricia Williams, now promoted to Vice President of Human Resources, personally oversaw the company's transformation. "It's impressive," she commented to Claudia during their first staff meeting. "In 6 months, our productivity has increased by 30%, our reputation has completely recovered, and we've received the Best Company for Diversity award in the country." Thornfield, on the other hand, had been quietly removed from his position as CEO by the board, retaining only an honorary title with no real power. His reputation in the business community never recovered. He would always be remembered as the man who was publicly humiliated by an 8-year-old. A year later, Claudia walked the halls of Blackstone as one of the company's most respected executives. The diversity program she had implemented had become a national model, and she received invitations to speak at universities and business conferences. Lee, now 9, attended an elite private school, courtesy of the scholarship Blackstone offered to employees' children, but she still preferred to spend her afternoons in her mother's office, where she often surprised visiting executives with impressive business insights. You know what the most satisfying part was? Claudia confessed to Dr. Martinez during a celebratory lunch. It wasn't seeing Thornfield go down. It was seeing Lee learn that a determined person, no matter how young or underestimated, can change the whole world. What about the other 57 people who were discriminated against? Dr. Martinez asked. 15 have already been hired by other companies that heard about the case, Claudia replied, her face glowing with pride. 20 started their own businesses with the compensation they received. The rest are using the money for education and training. Claudia smiled, a deep, contented warmth in her eyes. Lee created a wave of transformation that goes far beyond Blackstone. That same afternoon, Lee was in her corner of the office when a group of college students came to visit the company for a project on leadership. One of them asked what advice she would give to young people facing injustice. "Never let anyone tell you that you're not good enough," Lee replied with a wisdom that continued to amaze adults. "And remember, sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone underestimates." As the students left, visibly impressed, Claudia watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and admiration. That brave girl who had turned a rejected job interview into a corporate revolution was already planning her next project, a program to teach children from disadvantaged communities about labor rights and social justice. Richard Thornfield tried to destroy a family's dreams, but ended up destroying only his own reputation. Claudia and Lee learned that true revenge is not to repay the prejudice they suffered. It is to achieve the success their oppressors could never imagine, and to use that success to open doors that others tried to close forever.